In 1940, the forces of Nazi Germany swept across Europe. Panicked, the British authorities demilitarized the Channel Islands, leaving some 60,000 British citizens subjugated to the Third Reich. In 1942, Hitler needed British hostages. He ordered the deportation of over 2,000 men, women and children from the islands to the depths of Nazi Germany.
I first heard of the deportations when I came home from school. My mother was in quite a state.
My parents were really crying, and I couldn't think what it was.
My father hadn't yet got home. He hadn't read the Guernsey Press. And there it was in black and white.
They said, look at this, and they gave me the paper to look at, to say that we had to go on the Monday. Just like that. It was so sudden. So I started to cry then.
So we knew, with my father being English, that we would be included. And then we waited for the notice coming.
After my father had registered the family at the Gref office, Her Majesty's Gref office in St. Peter Port, we then, a couple of days later, had a visit from a German military policeman and a Guernsey policeman who hand-delivered the deportation order, which said that we had to report to the Gaumont Cinema in St. Peter Port in 2 days' time.
I always had a grievance over was that it was a Guernsey policeman that came along with the paper saying that we had to go.
We were allowed to take a suitcase each.
There was a tremendous hunt around for suitcases.
A mug, plate, something for water, knife, fork and spoon. My utensil for carrying liquid was a small Guernsey can.
I felt when we left Sark, I'm not going to let the Germans see me cry, and I jolly well didn't.
I always vowed you I'd never leave Sark without her.
And you didn't.
And I didn't.
Madly in love, you know, and I thought, well, I'd better go with him. Well, I don't know if I could have got out and not going. I don't think so, but there we are, you know, we always follow our true love, don't we?
9 of us were congregated
That's
to go on the harbour, and we waited and waited for the other 2, and they didn't turn up.
Well, we just had to bear with it because we couldn't do anything about it. No good fight.
And they were found, and it was terrible weather. It was raining and blowing, and it was an awful time of the year, that September. And they found them, and
he were outside in the field. He
was dead, and she recovered.
We couldn't fight the Germans and say we're not going. No point in that. You'd have got shot. So we just had to carry on.
Some people had to have their pets put down, others found homes. We found a home for the family cat, fortunately.
We got on the boat and then we had to get off again because it was rough, very rough, and it was an old coal ship.
The next morning, finally, it was decided that the sailing was postponed and we should go home. So off we trudged back to Victoria Road, and we arrived at number 86 Victoria Road to find the front door wide open and the house completely looted.
Then when we came back, some neighbours told us that the landlord had gone with a cart and taken nearly all our belongings. So we had nothing to come back to.
Which didn't surprise us when we thought about it, because at the bottom of the Victoria Road was where the forced and slave labourers, workers lived, and we knew they lived in absolute filth and they had nothing
27th of September, we boarded the German vessel Minotaur at 6 p.m.
Well, some of us had heard on around about these camps, you see, and you never knew. That was like when we went away. We didn't know where we were going, what was going to happen to us. And I think everybody on the ship cried.
We were absolutely terrified.
Left St. Peter Port at 11:30 p.m. We all laid on deck singing.
It was a beautiful night, a beautiful, calm, moonlit night. The sea was as flat as a mill pond, and we left the harbour singing
There'll always be in England and God Save the King.
Sanya Cherie, anything, you know, sort of that could cheer our spirits and let the Germans think we couldn't care less what they were doing to us.
And arrived at St. Malo at 5 a.m. on Monday the 28th and landed at 8 o'clock.
And we got to St. Malo, and it seems to me the French people almost welcomed us. I'm sure they gave us apples and things.
And boarded train.
The Germans always very fond of their sausage. A sausage and a lump of bread loaf was put in through the window, which people shared.
We didn't know where we were going, naturally. We didn't have a ticket. And
but then we travelled across France.
When we got near any cities in France, we had to pull the blinds down, especially Paris.
It was 3 days it took to do this train journey.
We sat in Cologne station. We were only about half an hour down the road after we'd left when they flattened Cologne that night.
Across Holland, Belgium.
I remember being so thirsty and hungry that we thought, oh, you know, give anything for a drink of water. And they did stop in one of these towns and sent some water for us to drink.
The journey wasn't bad until we got to Dalston, and that was dreadful.
It was a stalag, I think, a former prisoner of war camp.
I don't think I've ever seen so much barbed wire in my life.
Hearts sank when we passed through the huge gate with a swastika on and saw huts and barbed wire. Taken to a room, signed papers, and then had to declare any valuables and handed over ring and money. We had to give up our engagement ring, and our money was such as we had.
Living in hell. That's it.
Then we got moved from there to Biberack, which is our camp for 3 years after.
Dalston really was dreadful. If we hadn't been to Dalston first, we wouldn't have settled so happily at Biberack.
As we got off the train to go up to Biberack, it was a big steep hill, and all the mums that had little children, all the little children were hungry and crying all the way up, and some of us younger ones helped to carry the children up because we were teenagers and the poor mums had to carry them. And
it was dark, it was cold and damp. And the first thing was you go through wire netting, and on this awful compound.
It was a conventional prisoner of war camp to all intents. There were barbed wire, there were electrified strands in the barbed wire, there were the goon towers with well-muffled Germans sitting up there with a searchlight and a machine gun. We were all marched onto this large parade ground, which was very, very stony. It was bitterly cold.
And my husband said to the Germans, surely there's no need for the children to be out, so he put a gun to his head, told him get in line.
Reg broke ranks to bring me a blanket to wrap round my shoulders. But I was afraid of, you know, what the Germans might have done to him, because, I mean, they were all stood around with their rifles and guard dogs and Alsatians and goodness knows what. So I made him go back with it. I wouldn't take it. Anyway.
He was very cross.
He was very cross.
It must have been below zero. And we were then all separated again. All the men and elderly boys on one side of the parade ground, all the women, children and girls on the other side of the parade ground. And we were then counted.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5 was emphasised.
They couldn't count properly. And one lady fainted because it was bitterly cold.
His eyes fight drive there, thump, and then they'd lose count.
Because I don't think they ever got the numbers right the whole time we were there.
And we must have been counted, I don't know, half a dozen, 8 times, and they never got it right.
And we always saw the Germans couldn't count above 5.
We got marched up to this place, into this room, and everybody had to strip naked.
They separated us by age, and they grouped us into the various about 10-year brackets. And I remember the German said that the British people are a clean people and the German people are also a clean people, so you will be deloused. And we wondered just what that entailed. But and he said that you who are the youngest and the strongest will be deloused first. You know, by this time it was about midnight, so we found that we of the younger group were going to be processed, as it were, right away.
And it always comes to me then as to how fortunate we were with our nationality, because they went into what they thought was water coming out, and it didn't. What ours was water. And it never left me that that could have happened.
And we found our complement in the end was over 50 men in this room. Yeah. And some of the bunks were 3 high, some only 2. My brother and I were in one barrack. My father was in another barrack, and my mother and younger brother were in another barrack.
My father was separated, and of course all the barrack blocks were locked at night.
When we were in Compiègne, we were issued with these, which is our number, and my number was 10,011, and my mother's was 10,013.
And I can't imagine that the routine ever changed. It was prayers, early to bed, a reading from Ulysses or something like that, and nothing very racy, I'm afraid. And in the morning it'd be the usual routine: up, wash, shower, clean your teeth, get dressed for school, go and see your mothers, try and get some extra breakfast.
First Christmas. We only had a piano. We didn't have any other musical instruments then. And some of the men in the barracks pushed the piano round to the different barracks so as they could sing carols. I don't know who the pianist was, I can't remember. But there must have been about half a dozen men with combs and tissue paper. So we sang carols to that, and we went around the different barracks. And our last one we sang to the guards, Silent Night, Holy Night. That would have been our first Christmas.
Christmas Day, up at 7:30, met Reg at 8:45. He gave me such a sweet card, hidden messages, felt just a bit miserable and had a weep on my own.
But it was a very sad time. You know, you thought of Christmases before and what's going to happen next. Because you didn't know from one day to another what was going to happen to you.
Living conditions improved because the nasty Nazi guards were withdrawn and they were replaced by some very, very decent German reserve soldiers.
To a certain extent, I think the Germans had a certain amount of respect for the British, whatever else they might have felt.
Our people, they all had families. If they didn't have families in the camp, they had families back in Guernsey. And I don't suppose it would have been too clever to actually cause any real hassle.
There was a Nazi element still amongst the guards, some of whom we hated, and they hated us.
The Germans had their organisation for their camp and their guards, and then we had our own local organiser.
Oh, the camp leader was Garfield Garland. I think he was a good choice. He was head and shoulders taller than anybody else. His second in command was Reverend Laxton, who spoke German and who acted as an interpreter.
Really, happily, one had little to do with the German administration, provided things were running smoothly, you know.
And I think they had a sort of committee of, you know, older people who looked after our welfare, met up with the Red Cross and generally oversaw what was happening in the camp.
And of course there are countless chores to be done and fatigues and administrative things to do.
The camp was like a village, eventually. It quickly settled down like a village because everybody did what they were best able. Like there were teachers, musicians, cooks, cleaners, office boys or
Cobblers.
typists and cobblers.
Dentists and doctors.
Bartomart
We had somebody from all walks of life, it seemed.
All walks of life, yes.
It wasn't long before we were out working on parties, work parties.
In fact, one went out to the radio shop, and within a relatively short time there were enough parts in the camp to make a radio.
As time went on, Frank Struband had what they call the Whisper, the Forbidden Whisper, I think it was. So yeah, we were up to date.
The camp was run by the Wehrmacht, the army, as it were. They didn't want anything to be found that would incriminate them. So it would appear that the officer told Frank that they knew there was a radio in the camp and they'd look after it until the search was over and give it back.
There was an official radio which was sealed.
Ah.
Which everybody could listen to.
Everybody could listen to it.
You could listen to it, you couldn't tune it.
The German radio, which would tell us all sorts of things, how clever they were, which you halved what they said and doubled what we'd taken.
The highlight of the day was the post office, where we would go up and wait to see if there were any Red Cross letters.
We found ourselves in the happy position that we could write to Guernsey and also write to the mainland.
We were allowed 3 letters and 4 cards a month. So I could write to my mother, and my mother and sister, they were both in England, would send photographs of themselves to me, which I could then send to my father. So yes, and whatever Dad said, I could repeat.
So we were rather useful because the people in England couldn't send to Guernsey, but they could send to us, and we in our turn could send the message on to Guernsey. I mean, heavily disguised in some instances, you know, that people would read into, you know, Uncle Tom came over the house last night, or something like that, which meant there was an air raid, or you know what I mean. It was all our mail obviously was censored.
I remember someone saying once, oh, well, I wrote home and I said we had turkey, plum pudding and all the trimmings, and you can tell that to the Marines, you know, which was a way of saying don't believe a word I say.
My mother used to put in her letters, Roy and Fred had called, which was code for the RAF.
As the dates went on, the time went on, you could see the snow coming down the mountains from over towards Salzburg Way.
They used to have a cup of tea, so what you used to do, you used to drink that, but you use part of it for your wash, because it's so cold when it is really, really cold in a country like that. It can be very cold, so you used to use a bit of that tea on your face flannel to have your wash.
The German rations were very basic and consisted of, well, cabbage soup, which we call Blue Danube or something, and a sauerkraut, and there was a form of dried fish, and we had a bread ration.
With a date on, but you didn't know what month, when you cut the green off.
And it was divided per room, so I was in a room for 18, 9 each side, so we sort of had a loaf and it was divided between, and you picked, you know, they started at the top of the list to take the first slice, and the next time round, you know, you were at the bottom of the list, so everybody had a turn to pick first.
So you had a piece of bread about that thick, you know, and you ate it all in one go. You didn't, and so you went hungry for the rest of the day.
What the Germans brought was sort of badly cooked, and what the Red Cross supplied were tins. There was no fresh food. We blanched dandelion.
Dandelion leaves to like make a sort of put on our bread, you know, because we think that'll keep our blood rich, because it's supposed to stop you having spots, because lots of people used to break out in scabby things.
And really, that was the only greenery we had. There was no fresh food.
But it was really thanks to the Red Cross that they raised our whole standard of living. In fact, they virtually saved us from near starvation.
Before the Red Cross parcels came, well, it was pretty grim before then.
We'd have been very, very hungry by the end of the war if it hadn't been for the Red Cross parcels.
One of the things I remember in the Red Cross parcels, and I still remember today, and always if I see some I'd buy them, is dried bananas.
Half a pound of chocolate biscuits, box of confectionery.
You could make yourself a nice pudding, you know, that sort of thing. I don't know if we'd like it now, but still. There was tins of clim, and you had these big, I suppose they called them army biscuits, you know, thick things like that. So if you put them to soak in this clim, and they were always raisins.
It's amazing what you can do.
There was piles and piles of tins.
Tin of Nestle's milk, tin of pure butter, tin of 3 fruits marmalade.
The camp leader, he asked the Red Cross, could we possibly send some to the Channel Islands, and they agreed for a while.
We were better off food-wise in Germany than the Guernsey people were in Guernsey, especially towards the end of the war.
Because a lot of people never thought we'd ever be seen again. But fortunately for the International Red Cross, we were.
And to this day, those of us who were there, we could live on what other people throw away.
Every bit of the Red Cross parcel is valuable.
Oh, make do and mend, that was easy. And when they put anything down, it was gone. Like a hammer or a saw or pinchers or something, it went. It got lost. We had it, yeah.
Tin from the Red Cross parcels. One of the favourite was the clem tin, because it was the biggest thing. You could roll it out, you had quite a sheet of metal.
One guy wanted to roast a little bit of his dinner or something, so he made a tin. Like made a roasting tin. And
make a water heater out of the clim milk tins, and I don't know, you plugged it in somehow.
Red Cross parcels came in boxes, and I can remember one of my jobs was straightening the nails, you know. When they took them out, they were bent.
Firstly, the string around them. That was a great commodity, because you'd be surprised what you can do if you've got nothing else except the string. The other thing was the actual cardboard itself. They did cut it up into different sorts of things. It was used in the shoes along with the string.
Some Greeks people were sent to us, and he was a shoemaker. And he had the women plaiting the box cord to make shoes. And he made a pair of slippers and a pair of sandals for every child in the camp.
What the wood itself, well, you get hold of a little piece. I'd got a little piece. It wasn't very big and wasn't very wide, as you can see here by this, but you made a spoon out of it. I made quite a few of those.
The tea chests that the Canadian parcels came in were used to make, you call them flats, as part of scenery, but everybody could do something, and you had the time.
People that could dance or do anything would get up and do something, you know.
We had a choir, and of course we had church services, because we had some ministers with us. They had a concert party, and they used to put on plays.
They used to have weekly dances. The camp orchestra was formed.
we had a dance band of about 11, and I was the drummer.
There were plays put on and musicals.
Blokes dressed up as women and all that.
Netball, rounders, football teams, Marathis.
We used to play shove, they had shove biscuit, I remember, in lieu of shove halfpenny.
Walk round and trying to keep fit, and then most couples would go and have a little lay down in the afternoons, you know. And there was a special place down behind one of the barracks that all the courting couples used to go down there. And if you saw somebody going round behind that barrack, well, you wouldn't go because you know that they're making love, you know. You have to wait your turn.
And because when we were all separated, that was the biggest shock of all. I know my mum and dad, you know, were very... I couldn't believe it, really.
Well, I think that's how my first child was made, behind the hut. He laughs when I tell him. I said, you were made on the grass behind the hut.
You had to motivate yourself, if you like. You could learn almost anything because there was somebody there that could have taught you.
Our schooling in the camp, they did the best they could with it.
We didn't get a lot of choice. We had a camp library, but every book which came into the camp was closely scrutinised by the Nazi organisation.
It's got here, the actual YMCA here, stamp in the book. The other one's a German censor stamp to say that we're not going to blow Germany up with this book.
There were to be no books written by blacks. There would be no books about any other religion except Christianity. There were no books which were derogatory to the Germans or which showed the Germans being beaten in war or anything like that, which was silly, really.
Gwen Barnett, who is still alive, was a pupil teacher over here, so she took the babies.
Gwen Barnett, she was a school teacher anyway. She is a professional school teacher. She was just very young then.
Because he was a bit of a nuisance, was our George. He still remembers me, though.
She'll tell you how bad I was.
We started off with having a group of children, an empty room, and slates, you know, similar to roof slates, and some scratchy slate pencils, and that was the sum total of the material we had to start with. Well, then we got a bit of chalk, I think, and a blackboard. But after a while, the Red Cross again came to our help, you see, and they sent in educational material.
In the early days of the camp school, we had a pencil and bridge scorecards and instructed very, very firmly, do not press hard, because when we'd written the answers, they all had to be rubbed out, so you could continue to use the bridge card.
I never thought that I should be in bivouac as an internee. An internee is not a guest, and sometimes he may feel depressed, but internees do not complain. They know they'll soon be home again. Homes are back in old Guernsey, but we are here in Germany.
It was boring. Every day, yes, was the same.
We used to go on these walks with a guard.
About 200 of us at a time. They used to take us out once a week.
On the side of the roads were apple trees, and when the apples were there, you'd pick up the apples.
They took us in the woods so that we could gather sticks, because we only had about 6 briquettes a day to warm. They had stoves in the room, so we used to sort of keep the briquettes till the evening, you know, when we were all, because we were all had to be locked up about 10 o'clock at night.
And I can remember when we went out on walks, I said we had to have a ticket to go out on the walk. You were only issued a barrack at a time. Well, of course, in the other barracks, lots of elderly people didn't want to go, so I used to rush round to the barrack to get a ticket, and I went out every day. But I hated Saturdays and Sundays, because I had to walk round and round that blooming old compound.
Getting out of a thing was something marvellous.
Oh, a big cloak had dropped off of you.
1943 was a good year. Okay, the Allies were starting to win the war. We had plenty of Red Cross parcels. Really, we did have plenty. And the people in the Channel Islands had virtually nothing. And that was a good time for us. But for some reason, and I can never find out, and I think we all asked, why did the camp decide to have a carnival?
Funny, we called it a carnival.
August bank holiday. Now, actually, I ran a race in that, a relay race.
It was a bit of fun, give life to the camp, and of course the Germans thought that was fine, yeah. And then they broadcasted that oh, these people, British people in camp, they're having a lovely time. They're, you know, they're doing carnivals and things like that. But that was good propaganda for them.
And there were people who had wonderful fancy dresses. And there were girls who ran races, bigger girls than me, who ran races. And they were taking bets on them, you know.
They took 16mm film, and they said, yes, you can borrow the hand carts, which people towed things and supplies around the camp. You can borrow this, you can borrow that. They gave people more wood. The theatre club and the music society all clubbed in, and people built floats, and they dressed up, and they found enough wood for people to walk on stilts.
I used to look after Rose Waring's little boy Rex. He's the little boy who died of meningitis.
My father was taken off the train. He became really, really sick. Ended up in the hospital, and he died. And then Marcia died shortly afterwards through meningitis. So I was virtually on my own then. They didn't really know what to do with me.
My brother died. And like I say, it was a very painful death because it was meningitis, and he was only 9 months old. And I remember him picking up his own weight on his arms and his legs with the pain of pushing up in the air because of the terrible agony. And those days, I suppose, there was no treatment, I don't know, but that's the way he went. It took a while as well to die.
I think it was harder for the younger mums with younger children, like Rose, because Rex was only maybe 18 months old. And of course him and 2 other little children in the barracks got meningitis. I think all 3 died actually.
I think perhaps as the Americans, British and French moved forward, so camps were emptied and moved to us because we were nearer Switzerland than anyone else, I imagine.
And toward the end there were imports of some Jewish contingents. And Auntie Medwell, who was barrack leader, organised a collection of clothes.
Oh, we had a group of Dutch Jews came in, and we had some, was it Greeks? We had some Benghazi Jews came in.
In another part of the camp, which we weren't allowed in, were some Jewish people from Belsen.
We did have one who came from one of these concentration camps, and he was down in one of the rooms down below, and we were with him actually, and he was in some mess, you know. And there again, I often think back, I wonder what happened to him.
There was one little girl that I remember with a very gaunt face and a very, very thin, and she had these huge brown eyes, you know, and she really looked haunted. She really did.
Well, the war started coming our way.
When the air raid sirens went, of course, we all had to go into barracks and stay indoors. They wouldn't let us out then.
Planes were flying overhead, but this Messerschmitt went up in the air and he dived straight down, it seemed, well, it was straight down towards the camp.
And you know, like they say, you were stuck, you were petrified. This plane was coming like this.
As he spiraled, the tail fell off. And as the tail fell off, of course, naturally, he lost control.
And I thought, it's got to come to the barrack. It couldn't move.
Christ, don't hit us, you know.
And he went straight across the camp, just missing our electric overhead cables, and crashed in the hill just the other side of the road.
44, we saw the enormous daytime fleets of American Hemi bombers. Thousands and thousands, it seemed, of little silver dots with vapor trails. At night, of course, night was much more frightening, because night was when the Royal Air Force bombed targets. and the anti-aircraft fire would seem to be more intense at night because of the noise and the flashes.
English planes were coming over bombing all the big German cities, and the sky used to be full of planes.
On April the 23rd, the Germans said, right, we've had contact with the Allies, you're to fly Red Cross flags over all the main buildings.
The flag was made from a sheet and a swastika flag.
So everybody set to make Red Cross flags. But, of course, everybody got white sheets and ran broad red stripes from top to bottom and from left to right, which in fact was the cross of St George, which of course is the Guernsey flag. The day on which we were going to be liberated is St George's Day.
And we also had the British news on the radio, so we knew it was imminent. It was simply a case of who was going to get to us first, the Americans or the French. Well, it was the French.
When what we called the Battle of Biberach, when we were liberated, they bombed, Biberach was bombed, but of course that was only at the bottom of the hill.
They bombed the town in the end. They just dropped 3 bombs just to let them know they were coming, I think, you know.
In the last week, I should think, wouldn't it be?
Yes.
And we saw the beaten German army straggling along the road.
Yes.
We were liberated by the French army, and our local band played the Marseillaise.
We were liberated by the American Army, General Patton, I think it was, the American Third Army. But he did say that we were to value our freedom because it had been very dearly bought by many had died on the way.
And our camp leaders, Mr. Garland and so on, they went down into the town to tell the occupying troops from the town that we were there, because they didn't seem to know. After a while, the gates were left unlocked and we could wander out around the countryside at will.
Somebody raided somewhere and came back with these earthenware bottles of cherry brandy. And we were drinking cherry brandy that was lemonade. So you can imagine what happened. Boy, oh boy.
You remember the day we went with the bikes? I don't know how we got the bikes on different barns.
Yes.
We went scooting off for the day after we were liberated. As if we were on holiday. We just set off for the day. We had a bicycle each.
We had, we were allowed, I got a permit in there, we were allowed a permit. We could go about 6 kilometres around. We were free, really.
One of the things the Allies did is they pasted up outside the town halls in most German towns and cities pictures of Belsen.
My father took me and stood me in front of that poster. He made me look at it and he said, now, don't ever forget this, Margaret. He said it is your responsibility to see that this never happens again.
They come back, they say, we're very, very lucky. We're a camp not far from us, and what we've seen today, we can thank God that we're safe.
He said, you blame the people who did it, but you don't blame the Germans.
A camp full of 1,500 people. I mean, they were burning 10,000 people in a morning in places like Auschwitz. So I think that was a time when people sort of sat back and thought how lucky and fortunate we were. That is, those of us who hadn't lost family who died.
We didn't think we were worthy of being flown home, but thankfully someone else did, and we were flown back into quotas of Transport Command.
We went by lorry from Biberach to, can't remember the name of the camp, but an American camp.
And the food was fantastic. We hadn't seen ice cream, we hadn't seen bananas, we hadn't seen oranges. And of course the food was absolutely showered upon people.
And they were having gammon and eggs, and a lot of us couldn't eat it. We couldn't. When you haven't had food properly, you know, for a long time, it's very difficult to get into it. Although we wanted it, we couldn't eat it.
And then we got on the plane, and they were French planes, and they were all lined with blue, do you remember? But we had all our luggage in the middle. We only had
it was
boards to
seats
sit
all
on.
the way
That's
down.
right,
It was like...
transport plane.
Yes, that's
transport
right,
plane,
yeah.
We flew into North Holt and then was taken to Hendon Centre. Our first night back in the UK was behind barbed wire again.
Well, we arrived at North Holt, I think it was, and then we went to Cannon Row interrogation place, and we went in front of a panel of officers and customs people. Who were you, and this, that, and the other, and they issued you with your new identity card, and at the other end they gave you 5 shillings, I think, and 20 cigarettes, a travel warrant, and said bye, and that was your lot.
I remember walking around London with my father, and one of the Londoners got chatting to him, and he said, "You see what the Germans have done here? Look at this, flatten the city." And my dad said, "Don't be silly." He said, "The city's not flattened." He said, "You've got a few places that have been bombed." He said, "Where we've just come from," he said, "there's nothing standing."
Well, from Hendon I went to Poole with Mrs. Williams, and then we both went up to my mother and sister in Yorkshire. And she went back to Poole, and I stayed in Yorkshire. And Madeline had already filled in the appropriate forms, so we were back here within a month. I think we were on the second boat, the old Hantonia. I remember writing to the Home Secretary because I was getting the local papers from home saying that all these people were getting home, and we weren't, and it wasn't as if we hadn't anywhere to stay because we could stay with my mother. And anyway, we got to Sark in the October 45.
And then the downside was, of course, nobody could say when we were going back to Guernsey, so it was decided we had to go to school. And unfortunately, we were singled out. Brother Jim and myself went, he's 2 years younger than I am. We went to this school where we were called Nazis because we came from Germany.
Well, and you couldn't come back to the Channel Islands unless you had relatives or your house was waiting for you, because the States didn't want you to come back and just be footloose and fancy free here. You had to have a base.
They thought their house would still be there, their business would still be there, and they could pick up the threads again, and of course it had all gone.
And it was lovely coming off the boat to see the island. Oh, that was, I've got that vivid in my mind.
Because they came down with carriages and that to pick us up from the old harbour.
It's a wonder the horses were still living. A wonder that the Germans hadn't eaten them.
That's true. They were very hungry.
When I got to see my mother, I thought, oh, poor old soul. She looked so old and worn.
In a lot of cases, the parents, when the rations went to the children, and they sort of, well, not starved themselves, but didn't eat enough, you know, really. Yeah, my father really was very thin, yeah.
But when we came back, they said you can have your house. There was no floors, no stairs. The Germans had used all the wood for fires,
I suppose.
Well, he had a business here, an electrical business in the Boardage, which the Germans shut down the day after they arrived, and they just stripped it bare, and that was the last he ever saw. He saw the commandant and said he wanted compensation for it, and they said there was nothing they could do. And so he lost everything.
My father never recovered, really.
The debris of war was everywhere, and the place had a really run-down appearance.
I was home, and that's all I wanted, to be home to Guernsey. I miss my parents, miss the life and the sea, miss the sea.
If you live by the sea, I think you miss it.
My family, my sister, because I had a sister, and my parents, and the fact that we weren't free was the things that I missed most.
Freedom.
Yeah.
I've dreamt about the camp many times, and always something horrible is happening to me. Not anything nice.
Well, it was like a dream, really. I don't think much about it now, but at the time you think, well, where have we been and what have we done? Why us, you know?
The regime of the camp wasn't bad. There were some kind people. There were some not so kind, but there were an awful lot of kind people.
at least we weren't ill-treated, I must say, and as I think I must say, it was no hero's role. We were just, you know, we found ourselves, I think especially on the back burner.
I always felt we'd never get out.
You thought it would never end?
I thought perhaps the Germans would bomb the camp, you know, and say the British had done it. I couldn't ever see us leaving.
I think it made you learn to live day by day rather than plan too far ahead, and just to accept every day as a bonus.
Tomorrow doesn't matter. Tomorrow doesn't matter. No, tomorrow is not there.
I treasure what I've got very much. I love my family to bits.
It showed me that, you know, you've got to rely on you. Don't rely on other people, because mothers die, fathers become withdrawn.
I still believe you're not given to suffer more than you can suffer.
I think it hit me when my daughter was 13 and I was the same age as my mother was when I was 13, and it was then that it hit me what she must have gone through.
But it gave me far more, probably, than it took away.